for everyone. Our next speaker is David Nin. So David, feel free to come on down and start getting set up. Now, David is a long-time Koha contributor. He's been contributing to the project since early 2010 in various roles. Currently, David's community roles include testing bugs, social media and documentation. Now that's a very brief way of describing a huge body of work that almost everyone who touches Koha has bumped into somewhere. So thank you, David, for everything, and I look forward to hearing it.
Thank you. I wouldn't clap too soon. So just out of interest, because we've got a whole range of people here, so who has tested bugs for Koha, whether I was expecting quite a few hands up, and who has written a bug report to say something's wrong, and who has never been to Bugzilla and has had a look? So there's one or two. So I just thought before I start is to sort of go through the typical workflow for getting changes into Koha, or Koha. And most of you are probably familiar with that. So, you know, if someone creates an issue in Bugzilla, we call everything a bug, but it might actually be a problem, but it might be an improvement or it might be a new feature. Some smart developers write some code so that it does what fixes the issue or creates a new feature, and then someone comes along and tests the changes, and you don't really, as long as you can follow some instructions and make your way around Koha, then you don't need to be a developer at all. So that's why I've been testing bugs, because I'm useless at programming. But basically what you need to do is say, it does what it says, and yay. And then it can go to the next step, which is the QA team, and they tend to, as you know, they tend to be more experienced Koha developers, and they make sure the changes make sense and they follow the coding guidelines, which everyone follows, and once it's got past that stage, the release manager, which is currently Lucas from Bywater Solutions, he does magic stuff and makes sure it should go in and then puts it in for the next release. And then obviously everyone is normally running a recommended release and not the latest, greatest that's still in development. And so our wonderful release maintainers backport generally the bugs, not very often improvements, because that's what you wait for the major releases for, so that if your libraries experiences a problem, that a bug that's fixed by a bug, then you'll get it reasonably soon, hopefully. And I added this one because, you know, no one ever does this, so yeah, we ideally we want to update the documentation so that people know about your fantastic new feature. So that you can go to sleep for the rest of the talk, my pitch to you as the developers who do the things is just make it as easy as possible for community members to test the changes. And what does make it as easy as possible mean? So for me, it means I've clearly described the issue. I don't know why, but I like, if it's a bug, I like to reproduce the bug so that I know when I've applied your patches and tested it, that it actually fixes what the bug was. Or if it's an improvement or a new feature, you know, set out the requirements. And as I said, tell me how to reproduce the problem. So where it's a bug. A lot of developers create really good test plans with step-by-step instructions, and but some don't. So if you're wondering why your bug's sat in the to be signed off queue for a while, like it's been a month and it's been 2 months and then it's been 6 months, maybe look at your test plan and say, how... and probably you would have to fix it up because things have moved on. And I guess I like release notes because when a new release comes out, there's a swag of changes in Koha, and ideally it should have a nice release note saying what this does and why you need to know about it. And ideally they should be aimed at the people who are going to read it. So there's a lot of developer and architecture bugs. I don't try and write release notes for those because it's whoosh, that's for some of those. But for the ones that affect how libraries work, then, describing either what it fixes or what nice new thing it lets you do, so that you don't have to read through lots and lots of comments in the bug to find out what does that do. And sometimes the titles people assign to bugs are open for interpretation. Right, so you can go to sleep now, and so I'm going to sort of cover why I test changes and what I've learned, I'm not sure what the correct English is, the process I go through, and some tips for creating some bug reports, and some tips for testing and writing test plans, and tips for release notes. So I'm sure none of this is going to be new for a lot of you. But hopefully it's a reminder. And I thought of originally calling my talk, the things that bug me most about when testing bugs, but I decided to say what I've learned. So why do I test changes? And I like to learn more about Koha. There's a lot of modules, there's a lot of features, there's a lot of system preferences that I don't think anyone knows them all and knows what all of them do. And I know sometimes the documentation team, you try to work out what does this one do and why is it different from that one. As I said, I'm not a software developer, so it's a way to contribute to Koha. And you can help improve Koha. So obviously for bug fixes, we want to get problems fixed as soon as possible to make it as stable and useful as possible, and help get all those new fun features and improvements in that people like to see that helps you use Koha better. Some of the good things you learn about, some of the enhancements and new features way before they come in. You generally forget them, but then you're reminded of them and you say, well, that's nice. And if you're competitive, which I'm not, you get your name on the sign-off. So, and that's me not being competitive because I've been quite slack, and I've been quite privileged in the last few years to have time to test 1 or 2 bugs. So, what I've learnt, and I guess that was what I was alluding to before, and it's not the best word picture, but there's just a lot of features in Koha, and testing bugs, you cover all aspects, from some of the more technical developer ones where you've got to make sure the tests pass, or some of the new features, or fixing things, or trying to, learn some of the modules like recalls and what they do and how they work. So you get to try out a whole range of things, sometimes mostly successfully. So my process for testing bugs, and Lizette and Jason talked about the baby devs special interest group from Koha US. So I mainly use the Koha testing Docker, which is a development environment to let you have a local version of Koha running, but there's also the sandboxes which let you, you don't need to install anything on your laptop and you can test a lot of the bugs. Then I have to decide what to test, because when I looked this morning there was 200 and something waiting to be tested, so there's 1 or 2. So I have a couple of bug lists that I have tabs in my browsers. So some release managers have a keyword in Bugzilla saying release manager priority, so I look for any to be signed off there. Sometimes people say, I really would like this in the next release, so they put the release candidate keyword in for the next release. There's a list of all the bugs the things that need sign off that are actual bugs, and then there's a list of all the bugs that need sign off that includes improvements and new features. Sometimes specific community members just add me to the bug and I get an email, and so I'm happy to do that if people want something tested and hopefully signed off. And then sometimes you see the bugs mentioned on the development chat or the town square chat, and sometimes if I'm feeling generous, I'll have a go at testing those. And sometimes I just pick something at random because some of the ones I've looked at are too hard. What I always try to do for bugs, and I've probably said this again is too many times so far, I try to reproduce the issue if it's not part of the test plan. I work through the test plan, and then there can be all sorts of things happen. So in the ideal world, I sign it off, and it says what it does. Where I've signed it off, I always check Bugzilla again. Sometimes you can miss to change the setting, and it's still saying it needs signed off rather than it's signed off. I've started adding follow-ups for things that I can fix up, so sometimes terminology, or if you've ever had me say, could you please make sure that this commit follows the commit message guidelines, I might add that. I might fix them up if I'm feeling generous as well. If I'm not sure, I might add some questions because I can't get it to work, or I might have some ideas. I generally always have some ideas. Or I might notice some things that I think, oh, that's a bit weird. Other times the patch might not apply, so that means the developer needs to go and fix it up so that it works. Because in the meantime, a whole lot of other bugs might have been pushed to main, and they might have changed what this bug is trying to change. Failed QA, when it doesn't work, I don't do that very often, but it does happen. Sometimes people forget to add themselves as the assignee to the bug, and so I do that and update the bug details. Sometimes the default is when you create a bug is to say it's an improvement, but oftentimes it's actually something that needs to be fixed. And I also, often I add testing notes, and sometimes it's just for me. Some of these bugs go round and round a few times before they get finalised. So it's just for me to remember how I tested some things or set things up that weren't in the test plan. Sometimes it's a hint from me that should have been in the test plan, but anyway. And sometimes I also add a release note if I've figured out what this does, and I add a release note while it's still fresh in my memory. So it's not a long process, but it is a process. So the other thing I noticed before I get into some of my suggestions for helping me test your bugs is when you're creating an issue in Bugzilla, the summary should be nice and succinct, and it says either what the problem is or what this change does. That often appears in the release notes, so you want it to make sense to mere mortals. And then the description, some people leave the description blank and they go straight into a patch, and I guess that's okay, but I generally like to see some more detailed information, and for bugs, actual bugs, how to reproduce it or what the error is, and for improvements, what they're trying to do, and not supposing how you've come up with it is the best way. And for the architecture and behind the scenes and the coding ones and the refactoring and making things better behind the scenes, then, you know, why we're doing this rather than what some people put. And then you can add additional comments. So these are some possible solutions or what you'd like to see, not presupposing anyway. So it finally comes to testing. Someone's finally written patches, and it's come up in the needs signed off queue. So what I like seeing in test plans is a whole range of things, and these are in no particular order. And over the last few months, I've just sort of added things that I've noted, and I'm not picking on anyone in particular. So yeah, the commit message guidelines I'm not sure if they're guidelines or they're requirements, but I think they're probably requirements. But they say what should be in a patch. So, you know, the title and a description and the test plan and things like sponsors and things like that and how it should be formatted. Most people seem to miss off lately some descriptions about what the bug does, what the patches do, and sometimes the test plans are brief. So with the test plan, you have to assume that whoever's testing it doesn't necessarily know anything about this area of Koha. And I know it probably sounds quite tedious because you've been digging deep and figuring out how to fix something up, and you've run through a few times and you know how to reproduce it, but the person testing it might be brand new to Koha, or they might not have dealt with the acquisitions module. They might not know anything about preservation or ERM. So, so step-by-step instructions to say do these things. So if you were training somebody who was new to that area. There's some people that write really good test plans. So Carolyn's in the audience. And I'm not leaving anyone out on purpose. Thomas, he writes really good test plans, particularly for the developer-centric ones. And Nick Gore also writes, and as well as Lizette's up there too, so I better say Lizette. But most people do write reasonably good test plans, but, step by step, I don't know this area, tell me what I need to do. The other times people sometimes leave out is sometimes for more complicated things you have to do a bit of setup first to reproduce the problem or to have sufficient data in there. Sometimes because the sample data in KTD isn't always cover everything. So, and some areas are easy. So checking out, you don't need to go checking out an item. That's pretty easy, but setting up for testing some acquisition bugs take a little while. If you're not familiar with recalls, you have to follow a few steps before you can set that up. Everyone loves the circulation and find rules table. So, sometimes a little bit more guidance there can be help. And I just wanted to highlight some things that make it really easy. So Nick has his handy scripts, which let you populate a whole lot of data. Pedro from OpenFIF, you can just put a little command in, and it'll, for example, load a whole lot of ILL requests and other things, set it all up and set the system preference and things like that. So that's really handy to make. It makes it really easy to test because you don't really need to faff around. Sometimes there's cataloging bugs. I'm not a cataloger, so and Mark or Unimark can be interesting, shall we say. So some sample catalogue records that help you have the details that you need to test the change is good. And if it's useful, adding some screenshots about what, this is all in the wrong place, or a short video, because sometimes a short video is easier than doing 20 steps to reproduce a really weird area where you have to hold your tongue the right way. And so that stuff's really helpful when you're trying to test a bug. Sometimes developers just say, go to this URL, and you have to copy it, and I prefer just give me the instructions for navigating to where I need to go. I didn't put this one in here, some bugs say there's something wrong with this TT template, and if you're not a developer, you generally don't know where they are or what they are or which screen that's on, so yeah. I like to test plan steps to be numbered, because then I can say, this step didn't work. That's pretty, yeah. And sometimes when you have to set some values in various forms, because developers are changing the code, they put the field names or the database field names, but sometimes they don't. Most of the time I can figure out item lost for item record, but some of them don't necessarily match up with what the form label is on the form. So yeah, having the name and maybe putting those in brackets was good, because if we're not a developer, we won't know what the underlying field names are that you're changing. Sometimes there's bugs with lots and lots of patches because they've gone round and round. To declutter the bug, then adding obsolete keyword hides it all and lets you go straight to what you need to do. And bugs with lots of patches, so that does happen. I wasn't going to pick on any bug, but it took a while, and I put the bug number wrong. The recalls bug ended up having 27 patches and 932 comments, and finding we did sort of have a consolidated test plan, so you didn't have to figure out what 27 different things did. So, but if there's only 2 or 3, it's normally pretty easy to work out. But when it's that big and there's a lot of changes, then a nice consolidated test plan really makes it go quickly. Often to try and reproduce problems, there's changes to the database that you need to do using SQL. And because about half the room put their hand up to say they've written patches, I think they probably know how to do the SQL and figure out the tables and do that. But a lot of people don't. So actually having the instructions for how to access the database and then this SQL or an example is really useful. And often when there's bigger changes, there's a line in the test plan that says test everything. Or test this feature from woe to go. And so sometimes people just bypass that one. I tend to, unless I've got a bit of time. My suggestion, obviously there's some big changes like the Bootstrap upgrade affected almost every page. And the data tables upgrade affected lots of tables that are generated. And the code base tidy, touched almost every single file in Koha. So providing some instructions with a representative sample of things to test is a good idea. And lots of people make use of omnibus bugs, so they break down things to test into manageable chunks so that you're not spending a couple of days testing everything. And for those big ones, and the development people obviously talk about it, is pushing those at the start of a cycle so that all the other things that you pick up get fixed before you actually have a release. And my last, sometimes a bug title say XYZ is broken, or it doesn't work, and it doesn't tell you what's broken, or or what the error message is, or what they did to break it. So just going through the steps to say, being a little bit more specific, what should I have seen and what did I see? Oh, I've got one more. I use a separate browser to test, that one I use day to day, because often when you're testing changes that have JavaScript changes or CSS changes, then you have to clear your browser cache. And while I do use a password manager, I don't want to log into everything again. So I use Linux and a Chromium or a Firefox Developer Edition browsers so that I can delete everything to my heart's content. Cool. I'm nearly there. Oh. And often you've probably seen, people have seen me in the development channel saying, could you add some release notes? And I guess this is how I write them, and it might not be the correct way, but write them appropriate for the audience. So stuff that library staff are going to see, or developers are going to see, or system administrators are going to see, write them to those audiences. So, and sometimes, the bug title is not really sufficient in sometimes. So I normally try and say, this either fixes, or this is an enhancement, or it's a new feature, and this is what it does. And if it's fixing something, this is what it did before that was wrong. And examples are good too, particularly when some things are a bit more complicated than others. So, yeah. And to save yourself work from just before the release, then adding them either as when they're ready for sign-off or after they've passed QA can help. And for the documentation team, it gives us an idea if there's any change to the UI, or if there's any change to the, you've added some extra steps, or you've added some extra fields to fill in when you're doing something. It just makes it easier for us to identify which ones we actually have to write some changes for. And the baby devs talk by Lizette and Jason, they gave some resources. I've just put them there again. I use my cheat sheet, but the Koha US reference sheet is really good. And Brendan's steps, particularly lots of librarians, you've got Windows at work, so he's got some instructions on installing the testing environment on there, if you're allowed to. Well, lots of people use Windows, so yeah. And that's about it, and I've got probably 0 minutes, but I was going to... This is an idea I've had, and I've mentioned it once, and I haven't done anything, which I like. That tends to happen. I've got this idea of having some Koha testing instructions, or some kitties, rather than cats, to make writing test plans easier. Sometimes you repeat the same steps, to set up a basket for acquisitions and add an item and then close it, and it's easy to say, just have a closed basket with some items in it, and yeah. So basically, my idea, which having a chat during the working together days or after this, I'd like to, create some chunks somewhere that you can either be linked to or copy and paste it into the test plan, sort of like the coding guidelines. You give them a number and say, this is what it does, and then you can go and link to that or copy and paste it in, so you don't have to repeat common things again. And the other idea is, ideally, we could incorporate some of those steps into the documentation. But happy to discuss that. And any questions?